Preliminary comments. We want to show great gratitude to the staff of the Human Relations Commission and all their hard work of getting all 4 of these hearings together. And we just want to acknowledge that work and the back and forth that was necessary for this to happen. A few months ago, we embarked on reimagining public safety by virtue of hosting 4 public hearings. We began with evictions, then we had one on housing, beyond policing, and tonight on budget equity. As Nashville continues to experience this rapid growth and prosperity, this prosperity does not always relate, as Ralph Schultz, the president of the chamber, calls, to deep prosperity, meaning that it does not go down far enough. And as such, it means that only certain people benefit for what we have termed the IT city. But simultaneously, all around this country, there's a growing body of information, and other major cities have actually embarked on the idea, as we are, reimagining public safety. Often that's only considered as police and fire, but there's a lot of information that shows that there are correlations between housing, economic opportunity. We all know the impact of the criminal justice system. So it is our hope that during the course of these hearings that the report that we generate will be beneficial and helpful as Nashville tries to move forward. And in my hope of creating deep prosperity that will get farther down to those who are often living on the margins. In my own personal persuasion, we just came out of the Kwanzaa season. And important to that is the idea of what is called Ubuntu, which is in rough translation of South African language, it means I am because you are. And the challenge of that with all of this, and even the goal of the Human Relations Commission of, as it states, to promote and protect the personal dignity, peace, safety, security, health, and general welfare of all people of Nashville and Davidson County, that requires that we be able to see ourselves in others. And so as we continue our work, we'll continue to push forward to the mandate that the city has set before us. Our director, Melanie Fowler-Green, will take over at this point. Oh, you want me to introduce the?
I don't have a microphone.
Oh, you don't have a microphone. So does that mean that you're not going to talk tonight?
If I need to, I will.
Okay, well, you might need to say something.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. And I'm sorry, audience, that I've turned my back on you. I usually view these hearings as the opportunity for the commissioners to shine and for you all to hear from them and for them to be in direct communication and dialogue with our constituents. And I'm really proud of the work that we've done with these hearings. I'm proud of the reports that are coming from them. And it is definitely my deepest hope that this work will move the needle on the things that, that will bring us to deeper prosperity. And I've already done my little bit of crying in my last full commission meeting, but I just want to say that it's an absolute honor to have served the commission and the people of Nashville. And I look forward to continuing to work with you all in the next phase of my adventure. And I want to say a deep thank you to our guests today who have agreed to take time out of their busy schedules to come be with us. So thank you all.
Thank you. Our first panelist this evening is Councilperson Zulfat Sar, and we will allow her, she is coming virtually, and we turn it over to her now. Councilperson, how are you this evening?
I'm doing okay. How about you? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. Well, thank you all for having me, and I'm grateful to the Metro Human Relations Commission for putting this together. As Mel said and Pastor Davis said, it's an opportunity to educate and to listen, to share what the council is doing, but also to listen to our constituents and everyone, and to see how we can do better. I want to apologize for not being with you in person. I had a conflict. I will be going from here to another panel, but I very much look forward to listening for as long as I can and then watching the video for the ones that I missed, because I do think it's a teaching moment for all of us. So what my task is, as well as the other panelists, is to talk to equity in budgeting from the perspective of the Metro Council. And the first question that is put to us is, what is the equity goals of the council? I'm proud to say that the first bill that I signed on to as a council member was Resolution 2019-31. This was one that was brought to us by the community, but thank God we also have a diverse council this year that have 50% women, 25% African American. We have 7 LGBTQ members that allows us to be able to look at things from different lenses. We have our first Muslim, our first Latina woman, and so it was.
Excuse me just a minute, person. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Could the IT person see if we could get a little bit better sound in here? I don't know if it's just me. Yes, if you get the volume up a little bit on council person, you can't?
Let me see on my end. Is that better? In my ears.
Yes, but no, we are not hearing you very well.
All right, let me take out, let's try. I was using a headphone and maybe how about now?
Much worse.
Much worse. We can't hear you at all now.
Oh, you can't hear me at all now?
Well, no, wait a minute. Keep going.
All right, let's try something. I'm working on a couple of things. How is this?
That is better, and you're much clearer. If we could just get you a little bit louder, but you are much clearer.
How is that?
That is much better on the clarity.
There's a lot of construction outside my office, so I decided to use an headset so that you would not hear the noise in the background. But it appears as if I'm going to take the headset off and we're going to try it again, and hopefully the construction noise will subside while I'm talking. So if this is better, then I think it's important for me to be able to share or repeat myself and to be able to share with everyone that the first bill that I signed on as a council member was Resolution 2019-31. It was a resolution that was brought forth by the community. And I do want to repeat that because we do have a diverse council with 20% women, 25% African American or minority. We were able to rally around this resolution. What is so important about this resolution is that it clearly states that the council going forward, at least this council, I cannot speak for past council, will put equity and diversity at the forefront of all the decisions that we're making. When you look at the recital of that resolution, it talks about diversity and equity, living wages, access to affordable housing, transportation, and workforce development. And it says that as we're making decisions as a council, we have to make sure that we're thinking about all Nashvillians and that whatever we put forward will be something that benefits every Nashvillians. I think starting with that statement was very powerful because it sets the framework that as we go into this session, this is something we have to be very mindful of. So how do we apply this goal in the equity process, in the budget process? I look at it that right now what we've been doing and that I'm aware of is in 3 processes. One is before the budget is passed or before the budget is presented. The second is during the budget
approval itself, the process, and then the third one is after. So when we look at before the budget is passed, thanks to Councilmember Mendez and something that was also continued by Councilmember Toombs, those are past budget chairs, and which is also being replicated and built upon by Councilmember Allen, who is our current budget chair, is that we seek to educate the public. We want the public to be able to know what is the process, how does it work, where does the money come from, what do we spend the money on. We also use this public hearings or forum to be able to give the community the opportunity to ask questions from us and from the departments that are invited to this hearing. And it's been a very good process because it's allowed us to be able to talk directly. One thing that we've done this year is that in the past, because of COVID, everything has been on WebEx. We're going back to that now. But in the first sessions that we've done, we actually allow live questions from the audience. In the past, people emailed their questions, but this time we're saying if you're in the audience and something comes to you that you did not think about before, you are okay to ask it on the floor of the panelists, and that's been very effective. So this year, the calendar is actually going right now in December. We started the series on where does the city get the money from, and we look into the major sources of our budget. And then in January, we're looking into how do we spend the money? Where does the money go to? Currently, our budget is 2.5 billion. And of that 2.5, 37% goes to our schools. About 20% is on public safety. When you look at government and infrastructure is about 15%, and about 14% is debt service. And so what we've done, what the chair and I have done, I'm the vice chair, is make sure that we invite the people and the departments that are for this high percentage area to the public hearing. So we had one last week with the school representatives. And then on this week, on Thursday, tomorrow, we'll be talking to the judges and the MMPD and law enforcement. We'll be talking about public safety, and the community is allowed to send in questions. They're allowed to also watch and let us know what they think and ask us questions. We're also using the opportunity to ask the department, based on the budget that we just passed, how those money are being used. So those are some of the things that we're doing. And in February, the budget hearing goes on to have the community panel discussions. So you have where you're talking about to the departments, but then you also have community panels and individual residents being a part of the budget process. So this is done by the budget committee in addition to whatever any council member is doing to educate their constituents. So then when we get the budget from the mayor, and I do want to stress that the budget is originates from the mayor, and so it's very mayoral focus, and it's put together by the mayor. But once we get the budget from the mayor, so we do the preliminary education, we talk to people, and then when the budget itself comes out, we want to make sure that once we're looking at it, we now want the feedback on what does this look like? What do people think about this budget in particular? So we've done that in so many ways. We have hearings again with department where we ask them specific questions about the budget that they presented to us. We've done that through community engagements. Council members do different things. I host Facebook panels when the budget comes out, and I invite people to talk about the actual numbers and the numbers and to give their comments. Something else that has happened in the last 2 years is that the Minority Caucus created a budget committee. I've had the opportunity to chair that committee for the last 2 years, where the Minority Caucus and members of the Minority Caucus look at the budget and also say, are we seeing equity here? Where are the areas where we think we need to make changes? So those are some of the things that we've been able to do as individual, as a caucus, and as the budget committee. So what is the impact of those hearings and those either before the budget or after the budget? In FY21, because of the hearings and the information from the community, we were able to do a couple of things. We added a chief diversity officer for the first time. We also added a workforce diversity manager. The diversity officer is in the finance office. The workforce diversity manager is in HR. These are important because we believe that in order for us to be able to implement whatever rules we're playing, whatever money we put out there, somebody still needs to check that these are enforced. And that goes with finance and HR to be able to look into this and make sure things are being done right. We also reinstate the Office of New Americans to make sure that there is an office that is catering to our new immigrants in Nashville. For FY21, we also added a steps payment increase to our teacher salary. This was not in the mayor's budget, but we added $7 million to be able to make sure that we paid our teacher right. We added body cameras in 2021 as a way to say that, look, we need to be able to address justice system. We need these body cameras. We've been talking about it for a long time. This is about time that we fund this. On education, we added money to Nashville Grad and to the NCEC. These are programs that were going to be cut off. But from our perspective, we were looking at it to say, these are programs that benefit minorities and benefit people that are not typical educational trained, and people can take trainings to be able to get a job. And so these were part of what the Minority Caucus put forward in 2021, and we were able to add it to the budget. In 2022, we listened to some of our community advocates. Noah was talking about social-emotional learning. We talked to the school and asked what they need in terms of supporting our children with social-emotional learning. We were able to add 1.2 million to our wish list from the Minority Caucus, which eventually made it into the substitute. We talk about recreation centers program that were closed on Saturdays. And we're thinking, what about children in communities that need to be able to have? How do we engage our children, find alternative stuff for them to do? And so we put 125,000 in the budget to address that. We look at our support staff, and we realize that most of them at the time did not get pay dates like our regular teachers and everyone. And we realize that these are the people that are supporting the children. So we added 7 unpaid days with 1.4 million. Curbside library was something we did. Something else that we did that is very critical, we added about $1,800,000 to our mental health corps. This is where we have a mental health professional ride in a police car with a police officer when answering calls. We realize that police officers are now meant to be mental health professionals, and sometimes having police officer on the ground does escalate things. That is what we heard from the hearing, and we're able to fund this program that allows us to have a pilot this year that we'll be looking at next year. We also had 1 million for what we call Cure Violence Program. This is an alternative to policing based on what we heard on the ground that says that we need to have non-for-profit in the community that can tackle policing, that everything doesn't have to go through the police department. So those are some of the things that we're able to do in FY21 and FY22. So after we pass the budget, some of the things that we've also been able to do to make sure that equity is still at the forefront, we as a council, our biggest job is legislation and the bills and rules that we pass. That's the biggest thing that we do. And so one of the things we do is that we had an overhaul of the purchasing procedure. We make sure that we're looking at construction workers' protection, making sure that wages, there's no wage theft, and that our construction workers are being paid equitably. We also had a resolution on hiring minors on construction sites. Unfortunately, we had a death on a site of a minor, and we felt like this is something that we need to make sure we're protecting our youth on the sites. The council, from the last term to now, is requesting a whole lot more information from the department. And we're looking at the information as they're presenting it to us, not just when we pass the budget, but after, to be able to look at what people are spending. We've increased the bonds fund funding. We just did a resolution that added 40 million to bonds fund for affordable housing, because housing is critical right now in Nashville. One of the bills that I'm proud to sponsor was one that also asked that every time we put money in bonds fund, we also want to make sure 20% of that funding goes to small companies. This includes capacity building, as well as allowing small businesses to be a part of the construction and the development growth in Nashville. We also have half of Oracle taxes. Oracle was coming to town. Stand Up Nashville spoke up. A lot of people spoke up and said, what does this do to affordable housing? We were able to pass a resolution, non-binding, that says that when we do start collecting the taxes from Oracle, we will put half of that in affordable housing. So those are some of the things that we've done before, during, and after to make sure that the goal of ensuring equity is protected as we continue to work. So what are some of the challenges that we've run into? Because I mean, these are, not a whole lot of stuff, but I'm glad we're heading in the right direction. So the first challenge is that it's a mayoral budget. By the time the council gets it, it's already, put together by the mayor's office, and they will be talking about that. The changes that we've been able to make, while it's good, it's not enough. And so we need to look into making some changes right at the mayoral level so that at least we can make a dent in some of the things that we have to do. The other challenge that we face is balancing constituents' priorities. We talk about defunding police or restructuring our funding so that it goes to things other than policing. So we're not doing penalizing people, looking at preventive stuff. Unfortunately, when that conversation happens, there were constituents that says they want more police funding. When you look at some of the studies that were done, the survey that were done, when you look at the race of the individuals involved, it does not follow the race of the people that want that change. And so those are some of the things. And we have people in Black neighborhoods that says, please do not cut it. This is what I'm saying. So having to juggle those priorities is also very difficult sometimes. Community involvement is also critical. We've been having the hearings and not a lot of people are watching or listening. Even in the survey that we had last year, the participation from the minority community is very, very little. And so we need to make sure that we have people that are impacted talking to us, talking to the mayor as we move forward in doing this. Now, I'm going to hand because I'm trying to look at the time, and I hope I'm not talking too fast, but I wanted to cover as much as I can and answer all the questions that was put to me. And so it says, what do we need to do to institutionalize equity as a goal? I thought about two things. The mayor started the participatory budgeting this year, where we actually asked the community in North Nashville to tell us how to spend $2 million. That's a very small amount. It doesn't do much. But what I'm happy about is that it's actually the first time that we've actually had that direct impact or direct participation by the community in how any type of funding is being spent. I'm looking forward to an opportunity for us to expand on that as we move forward. The other thing that I also thought would be a good idea also, I look at the San Antonio budget equity tool. We, with our goal and what we've been doing, is been focused on the council, and we've been working with the department. But the goal says we want to encourage every department to also have the same foresight and to use the same lens in doing the budgeting. I would love for us to be able to expand it a lot more, to be able to actually give them the tools and to be able to see a situation wherein we're not just making small changes, but we're actually working as a city as a whole to get all of this done and to make sure that our city, our constituents are taken care of. And so with that, thank you all for having me. I look forward to learning more, and thanks for the opportunity to share at least what we've been doing, what we hope to continue to do, and more importantly, what we hope to build on as we build a Nashville that works for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilperson. I have one question, and then we'll open it up to the other commissioners. Well, I'm encouraged by your resolution to look at these budget decisions in an equitable fashion. How much political will do you think is resident in the current council to actually passing an ordinance, making a equity lens part of the metro law instead of, hey, we're going to work this way? And I say that to the tune of, how do you repair and address areas that have been long neglected? While I'm encouraged by the 40 million that you call extra into the housing fund, we have spent almost 2 decades now not taking care of that. So that fund is still inadequate as it relates to where we're losing most of the housing stock, which is in workforce housing and low-income housing. So I guess the question around the adoption and the passage of an equity lens bill. Is there any political will for that?
Thank you. My answer will be yes, because I do think that, and I'll speak for the council that I'm on, is that, you know, this council, in what it does, in some of the conversation that we've had, whether it's how we distribute COVID vaccination, whether it's how we're spending the ARP money, all of it, when you listen to those conversations, there is an equity lens that is being used. And that, again, is because you have a very diverse community. For majority of us in the minority that are minority, you don't have to tell us these things. We know what it is, and we could automatically support it. And then we have allies on the council. So I do believe that, yes, there is a lot to be done. We're not even touching it yet. I don't think we've scratched the surface. But I think you have to start somewhere. And this is a very good group that I think is ready. I will say it's also incumbent on the constituents to make sure that we continue to vote for people that believe and that will move the needle forward. That is how you get that done. But I can say there's a lot of people that wants to do this. That's what we've been able to do. That's why we've been able to do it so far. But we just need to continue to build on it and continue to educate and move the rest of our colleagues along.
Thank you.
Councilwoman Suara, this is Pratik Dash. Good to see you. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned how community involvement is so critical to building an equitable budget. And so I just wanted to ask, what efforts have you seen for elected officials or for the city to reach out to those who are directly affected to give input on an equity budget? And then where do you see barriers for the city to get that community involvement? Is it a technological issue? Is it that they're not meeting communities where they're at? And so just from your seat on the council, wondering where you've seen the efforts and what the barriers are.
Thank you. I think it's a mixture of so many things. I think there's COVID is not helping with us not being able to meet people in person. I think the first budget conversations that Councilmember Mendes started were supposed to be in person, and then COVID started and everything had to go online. And so knowing that not everybody has capacity is also there. And so, yes, and when I talk about community involvement, that is where it's critical when you're trying to move others along, where you're trying to convince. Now, don't get me wrong, equity work does not always have to fall on the constituents. The decisions that we as decision makers, as lawmakers, have to do for the betterment of our community. And that's what a lot of people are trying to do. But it's a 40-member council. You have to be able to convince those that do not believe in the equity work. And the way to do it is from constituents, engaging them, talking to them, us having data for the people that are impacted to be able to say, hey, this is what we need to do. This is why you need to support this. So technology is a part of it. I think, people are tired. And so we need to just find a way to meet people where they're at. That's why I started the Facebook sessions that I do, in addition to what the budget chairs does, as a way to just get information out. So I'm hoping that people learn more about this, people continue to become engaged. When we're having this conversation, we continue to encourage people that this is how we need to do this, and this is what we need to do. So there's no other way to do it. It's a whole lot of things. People have jobs and things like that, but these are decisions that are impacting them, and I think we need to make sure that we are involved. I talked about the survey last year. That survey was very good, very well put together. I was ready to go everywhere and talk about it and fight with it. But for me, when I look at the participant in the survey, and I look at the zip code that I represented, and when I look at the gender, the race of the people that participated in the survey, it really makes it difficult for me to tell a council member in North Nashville, a council member in Southeast, or somebody that says we want more funding, to be able to say, no, people don't want it because I couldn't find the zip code on it, or not many people from the zip code on it. And so I'm hoping that our community partners, people that are doing this work, will continue to help us. And I hope my colleagues and I will continue to reach out and build that support around this work that we need to do, that is critical that we do.
Thank you so much.
Are there any questions? Any other questions? Go ahead, Commissioner Vinnick.
Councilperson Suarez, this is Erwin Vennick. So glad to see you again.
Always good to see you.
A couple of questions to follow up on what Commissioner Dash asked. There are two aspects to having true public participation in a budget process. One is information, and the second, as we were just talking about, is access. I have some concern that historical information about how there's been underinvestment in certain parts of our community is not readily accessible to the public. And I'm curious as to whether or not that is something that we might foresee the council remedying sometime in the future. I also sort of go back a couple of budget cycles, and I've seen a number of different things that have been attempted in the spirit of participatory budgeting. And I know that term was used a lot in the last councilmanic elections. Under one administration, there was an attempt to initiate zero-based budgeting. I know in the last budget cycle, the chairs of the budget committee had budget hearings in various parts of the community, but we're seeing different things happening in different administrations at different times without any consistency in order to assure the public as to how that public input is going to be initiated. So I'm wondering what you would recommend going forward as a consistent methodology by which the public can participate in the budgeting process in advance of the mayor putting his or her budget together. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are very good questions. And I think that, yes, we need to make sure that the information is readily available. I will say that most of the information are online, and they're all there, especially this term. There's a lot of budget information, but I do think we need to break it down into how people can understand it. And so, which is one of the reasons why I try to do those Facebook meetings, and I do my newsletter where I put it in layman terms, because I know that not everybody can understand what is going on. Not to talk down on anyone, but I'm an accountant by profession, and so when they're talking medical jargons, I don't understand it, but I do understand the accounting part of things, and I'm able to explain it. And so I hope people will subscribe to those things. I hope people will look into it. I will talk it to my colleagues and the budget department on maybe we can look into making those files. They are there, but making it where more people can see it, and then maybe share those links where people can see it. I think we have to increase our efforts to get to the people. In terms of participatory budgeting, it was one of the things that I ran on. I honestly believe that we cannot do a budget without knowing what the issues are. And as legislators, we cannot sit down here and start thinking this is what the people need. So we do need to engage the people to know what they need in order for us to put together a good budget. And so that is the essence of some of these conversations. Now, participatory budgeting is not having budget hearings. Participatory budget is not talking to people about a budget we already put together, right? Participatory budget means that the people tell us what they want the money to go to. And so I'm glad this mayor started the participatory budgeting. It's a $2 million budget in FY22 in the capital budget. There's another $2 million in the next one, and the capital spending plan, that actually have community members looking at it. And a lot of people in North Nashville came out to be part of that process. People were excited. People selected projects. People voted on projects. And I think when people see the projects that they pick being funded, and they see those things being built in their community, I think it will encourage them to say that, look, I was part of the people that says we needed this here. And I think we can then keep talking to the mayor's office about taking it from 2 million to 20 million to 200 million. Oh, we don't have, yeah, we do have 200 million since a 2.5 billion budget. And so that's what we need to keep doing. And I hope that that continues. In terms of from one mayor to the other, again, it will come to the people if we do this one right, and I think people are excited. The result came out yesterday, and the people keep asking for it. Then the next mayor will have no choice but to do it, because it is what the people want.
Thank you so much, Councilperson Zolfat, for coming and sharing with us. It's always a pleasure to be in your company. And we are grateful for your service that you render, and we appreciate you appearing before this public hearing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And I want to share for everyone, my phone is 615-585-2558. Please subscribe to those newsletters, either mine or those from your council members. There are a lot of information that we try to push out, and I'm asking everyone to be a part of it and ask any questions. This is a job that you hired us to do. We work for you, and you need to hold us accountable, but we would not know what you want if you are not telling us. And we cannot, in a 40-member council member, sometimes we cannot push the agendas that we want without everybody being involved. So we need you to talk to all of your council members, all of them, so that we can move this agenda forward. So thank you all so much.
Thank you. We're going to move on to our next panelist, the Black Nashville Assembly.
Oh, thanks.
Good evening.
Hello, thank you so much for having us. If it's okay, we can start now. Oh, great. So yes, I'm Erica Perry. I'm a movement lawyer and organizer with the Black Nashville Assembly. And over the past, I think 4 years, have been engaged in training, organizing lawyers around participatory budgeting and invest, divest. And so this has included training elected officials through local progress, as well as training the National Conference of Black Lawyers, along with training organizers and activists in Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, Nashville, North Carolina, Mississippi, Massachusetts, and a number of other states, and then also collaborating on a fellowship to train organizers and lawyers who were engaged in their own invest, divest campaigns locally, and then in addition to that, doing research for and legal support for organizers on the ground who are engaged in invest, divest work. And so I think it's important to name because I've been working around participatory budgeting for a while, and so have a specific, and I think maybe unique to what the mayor and city council might think of what participatory budgeting is.
If you can go to the next slide. I know I have a clicker, but we know technology. We already know. Okay, thank you. My name is Jamel Campbell Gulch. First, I am from Nashville, Tennessee. My entire family is from here. I think we 10 generations in on the land. I'm the former deputy director of Gideon's Army, a founding member of Moving Nashville Forward, where we're trying to get guaranteed basic income in North Nashville. Also a founder of Black Nashville Assembly and a member of the Nashville People's Budget Coalition. And we're going to hop right in forward. We hope that you have a lot of great and difficult questions because we love difficult questions. You can go to the next slide.
Great. So the Black Nashville Assembly, again, is a participatory democracy, Black organizing, and political engagement project. We were founded out of the 2020 uprisings, and definitely in response to wanting to engage Black people in Nashville around public safety and defunding the police. And so we heard the critiques of City Council, and as we'll talk about in our conversation, we are clear that Black people want public safety, but that they don't want it to be reliant on police. So have had conversations with folks around that for the past 2 years. And for us, we have been organizing and working with folks as a part of in collaboration with the National People's Budget Coalition with a specific focus on Black people around participatory democracy and participatory budgeting. And for us, we define participatory budgeting as a democratic tool to invest public dollars into social goods and alternatives to police, surveillance, and incarceration. And really use that as a way for community members to decide how their tax dollars are spent and begin to shift power, because oftentimes Black communities and other communities of color, working class communities, are left out of those conversations. And so participatory budgeting, as we have defined it and as I have trained folks around it throughout the country, really is about also shifting power. And for us, it has to be married to an invest-divest lens and a framework, which includes divesting from police and prisons and surveillance, and really reinvesting that money into institutions and programs that foster public safety, that are community controlled and community accountable. And as you might know, invest, divest goes all the way back to MLK's freedom budget, right? Where he said, let's divest from war and invest in social goods. And we carry that on and that legacy and actually investing in our community.
Next slide. And so what before we get deep into it, we want to talk about our work. We have done extensive community outreach and had extensive conversations with Black folks who are directly impacted by the institutions that we're talking about divesting from. So over the past 2 years, we have had, well, right around 16 months, we've had 6 Black Nashville assemblies where we come together with Black folks to develop collective analysis and shared values around the issues that are plaguing our community, 6 mass meetings where we train up, we skill up, and then 2 public safety workshops. And I wanted to highlight those 3. And the public safety workshop is currently, we're doing a public safety survey. If any of you want to take it, you can visit 615safety.com, where we intend to take those survey results and build out a community safety plan that is not dependent on us being locked up, us being caged, and other punitive discipline measures. Next slide, please.
Right, and just to build off that, so as a part of our work, as Councilwoman Zolfat mentioned, we know that our community desires safety, and so we have been building out a safety plan through workshops in our assemblies. But it's important to also name, have been encouraging people to participate in the budget process through teach-ins and trainings, and then, of course, have surveyed thousands of people with the National People's Budget Coalition. And then because we know that the city council and legislative process is oftentimes difficult to understand and engage with, we started a city council watch program to create transparency and community engagement so that we know what's happening before budget season and during budget season, because we know that the decisions that council makes outside of budget season impact what happens with the budget, the budget seasons during the height of budget season. Sorry.
Next slide, please. And so one thing that we really focus on is we really focus on breaking down the budget into consumable ways where people can take it. Like the council member said before, you really need a degree in accounting to be able to understand where our tax dollars go. It takes a team of us in coordination with other folks nationally who work on city budgets to actually understand where our dollars go. And so this is one of the graphics that we have used in the past. Out of every $100 in the city's general fund, Nashville spends $36 on cop torch and cages, $1 on housing, 64 cents on social services, and as you can see on here, $0 on community-driven, community-led, non-police violence interruption or a credible messenger program. And we have to have all of those caveats because we saw last year an adjustment to where we actually had our law enforcement talking about being an alternative to themselves. So this is a very simple breakdown that we use to really talk to community members and paint a very instinctual picture or a very digestible picture of where our local dollars are going. Next slide, please.
Great, and we wanted to answer your questions, and so we'll just try to, we got 4 minutes, so we'll try to push it out. And so, again, Jamel talked about what we've learned as far as what the budget looks like, and so I've been working deeply with Community Resource Hub, I believe that's out of Philadelphia, and with the National People's Budget Coalition to really democratize the budget. And so what we've learned is that people define safety as housing, transportation, education, healthcare, mental health services, and access to food. And so, as we've said, we've kind of surface those issues inside of our assemblies, inside of our mass meetings, and inside of our public safety workshops, where we've drawn up together with community members alternatives to police and incarceration. And so oftentimes when we ask people through the budgeting process, through the People's Budget Survey, and then through our assemblies, we ask them what they want to invest in. And to be clear, we've had dozens of conversations with people throughout the last 2 years, and we ask them what safety is, and they don't mention police.
Never comes up.
Because the truth is people do want safety, but they don't want to be targeted by the police, and they don't want people disposed of. And so, as you can see, when we've done our surveys, people actually, and I think we're covering up a little bit, want to spend less on police and drastically more on public goods. And so, we are, and unfortunately what we've learned is that city council and the mayor and The Fraternal Order of Police are deeply invested, not in our safety, but in controlling back bodies and governing our communities through police surveillance and incarceration. And so, but the place that I find hope in what we are learning is that there are real alternatives that have been explored throughout the country, and that people in our own communities right now are exploring and are almost, and I would dare say experts in, or at least like heavily study it. And so some of that is transformative justice, which is a process where we can actually begin to address the harm and start to prevent it, and restorative justice, and community-led and community-centered messaging programs. And I hope that we can begin to explore more, but we know that the data suggests that people who have their social needs met are less likely to engage in behaviors that maybe would get them arrested and put in jail.
Next slide, please. So if you're curious, you might be wondering, if you have a curious mind like me, but hopefully you are, you might be wondering, what are some shared collective values that have been born out of the assemblies? What are some solutions, and what are some things that have been born out of assemblies? Before we get into this, I want to mention that the assemblies are Black autonomous space. So these are Black folks that share this analysis, okay? So one, right, like Erica was saying, there are some innovative ideas. We talk about what are the solutions to our issues, what things can we change that immediately change our material conditions. One thing that we come to when we talk about innovative ideas is lack of investment. If we don't have the investment, then we can't scale it it can't be a scalable idea, which is one thing that is commonly talked about. Two, an accountability structure, right? Recently we launched our City Council Watch program because people in our assemblies were like, what is going on in our city council to make them invest in this way, right? When we break down the historical investments. So an accountability structure for our elected officials, Metro City Council members, and our mayor's office. Three, people-centered and controlled participatory budgeting process. And when we're talking about participatory budgeting process, we're not talking about $2 million, $20 million. We're talking about the complete $2 billion budget, because it affects the way our lives are. It affects what we actually hold and our values and what we want to invest in. And then three, accessibility to the budget process. What council member did not talk about is how last year, in an attempt to actually turn the volume down on what we had started the year before, they actually made it where you could not call in to the budget hearing, right? Which severely limited the amount of engagement that we were able to actually do. Also, there's only one budget hearing where you can publicly state how you feel about the budget. So we know that out of the assemblies, we have talked extensively around what would it actually look like for the budget to be centered on people's participation, where people who have 9-to-5s, who actually have to work 2 and 3 jobs just to live in this expensive city, can actually participate in the budget process.
Great, and I'll just wrap us up with how we measure success. So as folks who have been engaged in participatory budgeting work for a while, it has to include divestment from police and cops and cages, and drastic, significant investments in social services. And then lastly, I'll say that we measure our own success at the Black National Assembly around how many people we are able to engage, because democracy only works if we can get many people to participate and decide how our money is spent.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you want to reach out to us at any point in time, power@blacknashvilleassembly.org is the best email for us. We're always open to organizing. Also, like I said before, we have a survey out right now, 615safety.com. It's a quick 5-minute survey. It's yes or no, but that is the whole presentation. Hope that you have great questions.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to begin here with Dr. Richmond.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. First, back on one of your earliest slides, you were saying you wanted more investment in care, infrastructure, and services. Could you be a little more specific on what sorts of resources you're talking? And then I'll have a second question in a minute.
Go back to that slide.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that's.
It's slide 7, I believe.
Can you go back to that slide, please?
Where it breaks down. It actually breaks down.
Yeah, this one here.
That
and
one.
So, yeah, the very bottom, when you're talking about the invest, divest, and you were saying you wanted reinvesting that money into community-led and community-accountable systems of care, infrastructure, and services. So I was just wondering kind of what you were thinking of, what you were proposing.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question because so I think it's a two-part answer. One, when we talk about systems of care, we talk about a community-driven and community-informed of mental health services is one piece, the health department seeing that increase, and also I think youth violence prevention and interruption. Because as y'all know, we've seen some very heartbreaking things happen among young people in the city last year. The other piece that's really important to that, and that's a part of the public safety workshops, is really surfacing programs that exhibit care. And some of those things have looked like COVID care packages as a way to help people. Some of it has also looked like sustainable housing that is dignified and humane. So when we talk about participatory budgeting and participatory democracy, what we have been doing is surfacing some of those ideas, and the hope is that as we complete our survey and synthesize what comes out of our assemblies and workshops, we can come back here again and present the safety plan that we have developed with our community.
Okay, and then I had a second question. On the two pie charts, we had the people's budget and the mayor's budget. I'm an educator, and I didn't see education on either one of those.
I think that's important to name because actually, education gets the most investment, right? But we don't have fully funded education yet, which we're hoping that we can get. But once you take education out, it paints a remarkably different picture as far as what our other dollars are going into when it comes to our public goods. When we ask people what makes them feel safe, they usually bring up housing, good paying jobs, hospitals, social services. And as you can see on the people's budget side, when we ask them that, they usually want a huge chunk of investment into that, right? But if you look at the mayor's budget and city council's budget, usually they invest a large amount of resources into police as a way to give us safe communities. So I think it's important to note is two things. One, we take education out so we can really see a full picture of where our other dollars are going. And two, we still don't have fully funded education, which also goes directly into the Nashville People's Budget Coalition report.
And if I could I just want to name one more thing. When we talked about community safety and the forms of care, one of those pieces is transformative justice. Right. And other ways to hold community members accountable when harm actually happens. And so at the heart of our work, when we talk about invest, divest, and divesting from cops, courts, and cages, it's really because we want to start to prevent harm and address it. And that we've been trying cops, courts, and cages for a while now, and it just hasn't worked. Like, our people continue to be harmed, and I think that it's time for us to listen to survivors, people who have experienced harm, and even people who might have been exhibited harmful behavior, to figure out what are the ways that we can start to address it, because what we have isn't actually working. And so that's at the heart of what we talk about when we say invest, divest.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Commissioner Diaz. Guess you need to turn your mic on there.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay, great. You mentioned that each budget season, there's one public hearing, and this year there were no phone calls. So I wanted to ask you if and when you win, when there's participatory budgeting here in the city, what is budget season going to look like?
If we were to implement participatory budgeting in the city, I think that it has to be a year-round thing. Right. And so I think it actually looks a lot of like the People Movement Assemblies and the Black National Assemblies that the People's Budget Coalition has had and the Black National Assembly has, where you are talking to people at least monthly about their issues, creating solutions, and then putting budget items to those things. And then I think it's also education, year-round education, because what we often find, and I think Andrew might talk about that, is when we're asking people where they want their money spent, it's difficult because the budget is $2.5 billion. I mean, most of us have never allocated that amount of money. And so we had to break it down into dollars. But I think it's also education, and then like ongoing conversations with people, deciding how it's spent. And then in some of the places that I've explored, you might have people who are elected from the community who come and they then decide based on what their block has, based on what their block says, on how the money should be spent. But I think it has to be a truly democratic process and engage with the entire budget for it to be truly participatory budgeting, and that we have people, and what's interesting, I have you ask that, because in 2020, January 2020, as a part of my job at Law for Black Lives, we brought together a participatory budgeting project, Center for Popular Democracy and Policy linked together to train organizers in Nashville on participatory budgeting. And we drew up a participatory budgeting plan for Nashville that actually involved conversations and people allocating the money in really innovative and accessible tools so that people who maybe are not accountants can really engage with the budget. But I think we still have a plan written out, so we're happy to implement that. And it's been what we've been doing with the National People's Budget Coalition inside of our coalition, but hope that we can expand it and that City Council will adopt the budget that we've developed with constituents over the last 2 years.
Chairperson, do I have time for another question?
Go ahead.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Appreciate it.
Ms. Irwin would have taken two, so you go ahead, Commissioner Diaz.
So we talk about what's inside the pie, right? But one thing I've been thinking about lately is the size of the pie. I don't know who the biggest real estate companies here are, or the biggest corporations, or how much they pay in taxes. So how does that enter into your analysis about the budget, the size of it?
Yeah, I think I want to answer it one way, then I'm going to leave it open for Erica to answer it. I think those special interests, and we've learned this through our city council watch, where we have community members plus ourselves in city council watching, taking notes, trying to understand what's going on. And the thing that we notice most of the time is that city council is thoroughly, and I think Erica said this before, tied directly into developers. If their community members are there, they're with us, and then there are developers there. And so I think what ends up happening is, since they are the closest to council, council usually passes budgets and legislations that are favorable to those entities. And with that being said, down to the fraternal order of police. So with that being said, we know that there's an amount that our city budget, our general fund, is expanding. Down to when we talk about the American Rescue Plan dollars that come directly from the federal government that was given to Nashville unrestricted, right? And so I think that if whatever we want, and we talk about this in assemblies, whatever we want, the time is now. It is now that we get fully funded schools. It is now that we get those investments and those other pieces of that we consider safety, because our city, no matter what anyone else says, our city has the revenue streams to actually solve the problems that we've been experiencing as Nashvillians for decades. And I think that's an important thing to put a pin right there. If you put together the American Rescue Plan money, the other streams of revenue that are coming through Nashville, we have the money to solve the problems. I think what we have to ask ourselves and what we need to be struggling over is, why don't we have fully funded schools at this point in time? Why don't we have a credible alternative to police that is invested in? Why don't we have a trauma response that is not dependent on the police presence? Why don't we have those things? When we bring together our assemblies, there's a North Star that we all have. And we need to struggle through as Nashvillians is, why are those things not being invested in? Because if they're going to be invested in, the time is now.
Commissioner Dash. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you?
Oh, no, yeah.
Commissioner Dash.
Yeah, thank you all so much for coming in. And sorry, thank you all so much for coming in. I appreciate it. I also love the pie chart, along with, I'm sure, every other commissioner that has mentioned it. So I think this question might be easy or it might be difficult. I'm not quite sure, but I think that looking at this, right, I think that a narrative that we heard in 2020 was that, we know that this is the model that we need to go towards, but it will take so much time to shift and to get there, and we don't have the infrastructure for restorative justice right now, and it will take time to build. So if it's easier on a scale of 1 to 10, just like how easy is it to shift from the right side pie chart to the left side pie chart, or if 1 to 10 isn't the right scale, like whatever is the best way for y'all to explain it?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, because one thing I think about is when we looked at the budget last year, one key thing we kept noting is that the police even had vacancies, right? And so what was that, 60 million? How much money was that?
No, it's 9.2 for 90-something vacancies.
Okay, so they had vacancies. So there was money you could take for vacancies, and then there are other ways that we can reduce the police budget, reduce the court's budget, and reduce the budget for the sheriff's department. And some of that is reallocating that money to like social goods and some of the programs that we name. And I think on a scale of 1 to 10, what's 1?
One being extremely difficult to shift and 10 being very easy to shift.
Yeah, I would say, and this is me putting on my public policy, public administration hat, I would say probably about a 7.5, because the money is actually there, and there are ways that we could significantly reduce our reliance on those institutions already. And it isn't about efficiency, it's about the fact that they actually aren't working, and put it into programs that have shown themselves to work throughout the country. But I think the other thing to really name as people are involved in invest, divest, and if we use that lens, is that communities deserve to experiment, right, and learn lessons from programs that they developed. And oftentimes we know that people who are most impacted by harm, who are most impacted by racial injustice, actually have solutions. And we just want to really be able to invest in them. And so we have some ideas around how we can begin to shift that money. Some of them are cars. I don't think they needed new cars. We know there are ways to make cars more efficient. But it really does mean and I think the other thing that's important to name is we talk about reducing the size and scope of policing. So a part of that is decriminalization, right? And so that there are a number of things that we shouldn't even be arresting people for, shouldn't have them involved in the criminal legal system, shouldn't have them in jail for. And so that is one way that we can begin to shrink that budget and invest in community members in their care.
And if I can add one piece, where there's a will, there's a way. That's just as simple as it gets. If they want to, they can.
We want to thank you, and I think that's a real poignant way. Oh, I'm sorry, Erwin. I was trying to move us on along. We've got a couple of extras. Thank you, Mel, for shaking with me on that. So I'm going to hold to this one.
Just a brief question. Thank you very much for being here today. And Commissioner Dash asked the first question, which I wanted to address, which is that clearly budgeting needs to be a year-round process. And if you just jump into the budget in January or February, you're already behind the 8 ball. Budgeting is also a political process. And so my question to you is, how do you go about expanding the base of political power through communities in order to get that political power moving in the direction of doing the things that you want to do?
Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think a few of the ways that we've been engaging people both around political education so that they understand the budget and the implications of the budget on our lives is through our mass meetings. And so for us, we are an organization that meets with community members monthly, and then we make political decisions together at least quarterly. And then we have town halls to discuss our policies and to determine the ways in which elected officials might be moving on those policies. And so the question, the way I hear it, is about like, how are we base building? And it has to be through radio ads, which hopefully you heard us on the radio, and through like door knocking and digital organizing, especially in the time of COVID, to have ongoing conversations with people so that they are consistently thinking about how they can practice democracy.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all so much, Black Nashville Assembly, for taking your time and expertise to come and share with us.
Thank you so much.
Now we will hear from the People's Budget Coalition.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to see if this remote will work real quick.
technology.
Yes.
My favorite today.
All right, there it is.
It's not doing anything from here.
No?
No.
Okay, she'll advance it for you.
Just so you know, on my slides, it's a lot of like transitions for bullet points. So I'm going to say next, and it's not going to be the next slide, just the next bullet point, just so you know.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. Greetings, everyone. My name is Andrew Krinks. I have been engaging issues of policing and incarceration in Nashville for about the last decade. And I'm here representing the Nashville People's Budget Coalition. And want to give thanks to the presenters who came before me, who are also part of the Nashville People's Budget Coalition, Eric and Jamel. Appreciate what they had to offer. And there will be some overlap because our work is so overlapped in actual ways. So next slide, please. So first of all, the coalition formed in late 2019, a coalition of community organizations concerned with issues of social justice, economic justice, racial justice, criminal legal system. Next bullet. Try it now. Oh yeah, great. Thank you. So a bit about what we do. One of our main purposes is to educate the city, people in the city about the city budget, to organize people to participate in the budgeting process each year, and to build and pass a people's budget that fully invests in the social goods that actually create safe and thriving communities. A bit about why we do what we do, why we formed the coalition in the first place. First of all, as has already been stated in multiple ways, the budget process as it exists currently excludes most residents, and in that way is highly undemocratic, actually. It's very difficult to understand. The budget document is extremely long. I do want to give thanks to the council member for the educational events that she does, but even those, as she's even said, are not reaching tons and tons of people. They are reaching some, but not enough. So it's difficult to understand. City doesn't invite meaningful input until the very last second, usually when the budget has already been created by the mayor's office, when most council members have already made up their mind, and it's kind of a symbolic 2 minutes for them to come and give their piece when decisions have really in some ways already been made. And so the remedy for that, as we've already been saying, is participatory budgeting. Erica gave a really great explanation of that, so I will skip over any more explanation of that for now. The other reason why the coalition exists and why we formed and why we do the work that we do is because this is the budget situation that we're addressing. And I'll give you some visuals that overlap a bit with the visuals that Jamel and Erica offered. This is, I don't think this is in the document that you have, paper document that you have in front of you, but that is a representation of FY21 from the General Services District Discretionary Fund. On the left there, you see the criminal legal system piled up in one, police, jails, and courts. And that far surpasses all those other social public goods listed there, health and hospitals, transit, affordable housing, parks, libraries, social services, et cetera. And if you were to stack all those ones on the right together, they would not even come close to the other stack. Now that's one of the disparities we're dealing with. Another way to put it, as Jamel presented a moment ago, if you think of the budget, the discretionary fund is $100, 36 goes to the criminal legal system, and all those other smaller amounts go to the other things, including $1 for affordable housing and less than that for social services. And as my previous presenters talked about, we want to think about public safety in a wider sense, and even as Reverend Tucker offered at the very beginning, that public safety should be encompassing of more than we typically mean when we say that term and when we hear it. And first of all, in almost all cases, the fact of the matter is that police are usually responding after some harm has already taken place. They're rarely preventing it from taking place, and oftentimes their intervention is actually making the situation more dangerous and more deadly, as we've already seen in the last year and multiple times over. And historically speaking, this is a whole other topic or subtopic within this, but police actually are not created in the first place or designed still even today to create safety in a more robust sense, but are actually created, historically speaking, for managing the outcomes of mass racial and economic inequality. In terms of calls for service, some interesting data that we actually have from the police department themselves that we analyzed. It's important to note when we think about what are police actually doing. It's important to note that police calls for service have actually been decreasing year by year over the last couple of years. And also it's important to note that calls for service, that term actually encompasses a great deal of self-initiated calls. So calls for service includes when police show up themselves without anyone having called them. So it's a confusing term, and some people are working on trying to get clarity on how they use that terminology. But at any rate, it's been decreasing year by year. Of all the calls for service that are made, this is in the last 3 years, about 20% are for actual criminal concerns or situations. Less than 1% are for violent concerns or situations, and about 1% of all calls for service result in a citation or an arrest. So basically, we can calculate this in terms of the time spent to say that about $100 million a year goes to MNPD to deploy officers to situations where they're actually not needed or where other parties could actually perform the task that is needed much more effectively. That's quite a bit of money. So what does create public safety if not all the things that we tend to assume are the sources of public safety? As Erica and Jamel spoke to, the safest communities are the ones with the most police, are not the ones with the most police, but the ones with the most resources, as Erica spoke to so well a moment ago. So that should mean, like we've already been saying today, public safety really should be encompassing of affordable and accessible housing, transit, healthcare, social services, parks, libraries, arts, childcare, et cetera. And actually, when we ask people what makes them feel safe, as Erica mentioned a moment ago, that people actually speak to these issues as sources of their sense of safety individually and collectively. And so what we have is a situation where we really like to put it in these terms of public funds really being looted in the sense of taken away from the things that could actually create safety in the ways that we know that they could create safety, instead given to fund armed agents of the state. And to do that actually, ironically, is an impediment to public safety as opposed to an expression of it, if that makes sense. So taking all those funds and putting them to places, to a narrow sense of public safety as opposed to the wider sense is actually an impediment to safe communities. That's important to note. So in terms of the organizing and engagement that the People's Budget Coalition has been doing the last 2 years, we've had multiple People's Movement assemblies, which are gatherings of folks in the community to talk about the issues that are important to them, to talk about their budget priorities, to talk about what their biggest concerns are in their neighborhood, to be educated a bit, and to have some cultural engagement as well. We've held budget workshops to kind of to make plain, as the council member was saying earlier, what it's really hard to understand. And I want to point out, I'm very far from being an accountant. I am not like an expert, but I and some others with the People's Budget Coalition and Back Nashville Assembly and elsewhere have put in the time, which is a lot of time, to learn how this works, and it's time that most people don't actually have. And so I just want to make that point. Also door-to-door canvassing, and really at the end of the day, we've engaged thousands of residents in person and virtually over the last couple of years. We've done these surveys over the last 2 years. In 2020, during the uprising of 2020, had massive response in 4 short days of 5,000 respondents. In 2021, when we weren't in the middle of an uprising in the way that we were in 2020, we had it open for about a month and a half and had about 2,700 respondents. Also, we'll quickly want to note that it appears that police attempted to hijack our survey this last year. We did not go public with the link to the survey online, but we had the link on a flyer at an event, a 24-hour display of power peace event, and police were there undercover. We've heard from sources, and within a few hours, there were a couple of hundred survey responses, all skewed heavily towards police and jail funding, and a few of them put their names, and all of them were easily detectable through a simple Google search as employees of the Metro Police Department, Nashville Police Department. So that seemed to be an attempt early on to persuade the results. But nevertheless, it did not persuade the results because what we learned is that, first of all, before I get to the survey results, is that through these processes, what we learned is that people do desperately want to participate, but they really don't know how because there's not avenues or on-ramps that already exist for them to participate in helping to determine how their tax dollars are spent. So there's this kind of sense of powerlessness, of not really knowing where to enter the conversation or how to make their voice heard in a meaningful way, as opposed to a kind of symbolic way. We've learned that working class and Black residents very much feel left out and abandoned by a city that's in so many ways prioritizing profit over people's lives. And people are telling us in the thousands that the city's hyperinvestment in police and jails is not improving their lives in a meaningful way. And I also want to note that we do all this engagement and a level of engagement that I think is well beyond what the city actually does in terms of outreach with people to invite them into the process of determining what the budget looks like. We do this and done it for years, and we're literally a handful of unpaid organizers versus a city who has a $2.5 billion budget. So it's a testament to the fact, like what Jamel was saying, where there's a will, there's a way. The money is there, it could be done, but it's not being done. And so often we've been ignored and dismissed, ignored as if this level of engagement is not actually happening, or dismissed on the basis of kind of petty complaints about the minutia of the calculations that we've done or the report or how we figure the numbers, but nothing really meaningful beyond that. So when we ask people what they rank as most important, time and time again saying affordable housing, education, transportation, and the demands that came forward. I see I'm at time, and I'll just kind of wrap up here. This is another kind of visual. It's in the demand document that you have as well of the mayor's budget versus the people's budget based on the survey that we did. You can kind of see the different breakdown there. And so these are the kind of divestments that we did a median of the 2,700 or so responses from the survey, and these are the numbers that we got in terms of divestment, in terms of investment. This is all in the paper document you have in front of you as well. So basically, in sum, thousands of residents here, representing all council districts, by the way, have told us directly that they want to live in safe communities and that they believe the way you do that is actually by funding public goods more than police and jails and not the other way around. So success would look like participatory budgeting, not just a little crumb of $2 million in the capital improvements budget, but of the entire operating budget. That would be a kind of a version of economic democracy where people actually have power to weigh in on how their tax dollars are spent to create the communities that they long for. And also, success will be measured by a passage of a budget that divests and invests in the ways that Erica and Jamel and I have all talked about. A Nashville, in short, that values people over profit. That's what I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Crinks. I'm going to ask one question as I prepare for questions from others on the commission. Has the mayor's office and our council offered to sit down and meet with you, or have you, on your side, asked to meet with the mayor's office or the council to share your perspective on the budget? And if so, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. To my recollection, we did not actually ever request that exactly, partly because so often those kinds of meetings are, the doors that close those meetings in are thick, and we want people to be more involved, the people of Nashville to be more involved, and so we've kind of chosen to engage on a more public platform than a kind of closed-door meeting approach, which I know is just kind of a different methodology and approach to how we pursue this change. So no, there has not been engagement with the mayor's office. Some city council members have engaged with us, very few, and very few seem compelled enough to have been willing to take any of it to the council chambers in the form of proposals. A few have, but those were quickly killed off before there was a chance to vote on most of them. So the engagement has been pretty limited, and like I said, in most cases, and this is all despite the fact that the first year we had 12 hours of people saying this over and over again into the night and into the morning. And then the second year of people saying it for multiple hours straight, again and again, and then kind of just mostly a disregard from it after that point. So,
Thank you, Mr. Crinks. Dr. Richmond?
Thank you for being here. I just had one question about your methodology. Were you able to reach out to the homeless community in any way and engage their input in these priorities?
yes, though admittedly not as much as we would like to. Open Table Nashville is a member of our coalition, and so a few of the people who come to our meetings are outreach workers, and so they were kind of putting it out amongst their people that they work with. And somewhere in the back here, yeah, on page 38, we had only eight respondents were unhoused, listed as unhoused, some staying in a hotel or motel, some couch surfing. So quite a few actually who would be defined as unhoused. But not nearly as many as homeowners, obviously. So more to do there, but there was some attempt in that regard. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Let's go to Ern Vinnick first.
Thank you very much for being here today, Mr. Crinks. A couple of questions. In your slides, you mentioned organizing assemblies, budget workshops, and door-to-door canvassing and surveys. Were those efforts separate and apart from the Black National Assembly or the same as?
So there's a little bit of overlap there. Some of the people's assemblies that they mentioned were the same ones that I'm talking about, but they also have mass meetings that are the Black autonomous spaces that are just for Black Nashville residents. Okay. And so that's different than what I'm referring to, but there was a little bit of overlap there.
Okay. Second question is, I love the graph that is on there as far as the distribution of funds. I'm wondering if you've done historically going back 5-10 years, because that's essentially what an equity lens does. It goes back and looks at how funds have been spent over a period of time. And tied to that, I'm wondering whether or not you've ever done the same thing with the capital improvement budget.
Yeah. So on the first point, yeah, we've only done this for 2 years. We did a report the previous in 2020 as well, and it's pretty much the same exact pattern. So we know at least for 2 years the pattern is the same, and we have reason to believe, just anecdotally, kind of skimming back through the previous budget documents, that the pattern appears to be roughly the same in terms of the disparity between criminal legal spending and the other public goods. But yeah, that would be great to do. One graphic that we do have in our report, which I'm happy to send, I think Mel has a copy of that, so that can be distributed if you need it. But we have a graph showing from 1977 to 2017 spending on police and jails, spending on housing, and then some other things. And it's the same exact pattern from 1977 in Nashville of massive spending for the police and jails, minimal for housing and other community development. So,
can I indulge for two more?
Two more?
Two more.
One more.
I'll take trucks.
So he's just
should be on. I'll ask the same question I asked you and I asked the previous panel, and that is that the budget document's a political document. So how does one, through the People's Budget Coalition, develop the political power to impact the budget process?
Yeah, it's a great question. And my answer probably will resemble somewhat Erica and Jamel's, in that there is a really critical need to, first of all, to reach people who aren't the kinds of folks who are coming out to meetings like this or to council meetings on a regular basis, or wouldn't know if you asked them to come where they would go or what time or who their council member is. There's a lot of folks who, because they're trying to survive, don't have time for that kind of political engagement. And so there's a deep and critical need, I think, to go to where people are and not just throw up a Facebook Live and expect someone to tune in, but to really go to where people are, ask them what their concerns are, and really entrust them with, being experts of their own experience, in the sense that they also have solutions for what is needed in a budget. because they are directly impacted by all these issues that we're talking about. So to me, it's that kind of neighborhood level, people's movement assemblies, kind of visiting even neighborhood association meetings, getting kind of in those networks a bit more, and really helping people to see that that they do have power if they kind of collect that power together. I think that's great.
And the last question goes to the premise that about safest communities are the ones that invest in funds as we articulated. And I'm wondering if you are aware of any examples of communities where that has happened, where it has been a reconsideration of safety in those communities.
Mm-hmm. Well, on one level, we already have communities where people are well-resourced for complicated historical reasons, including white supremacy and all these things, where police presence is quite different and almost non-existent, and where there's not a fear of getting pulled over for not using a turn signal, et cetera. And so there, in some sense, there already are neighborhoods here where there's not a fear of police because there are people who are well-resourced. Now, the question of the fact that there is a Belmead versus a North Nashville is part of, of what we're talking about here too, is that the experiences there are so different, in part because the wealth and the injustices are so different. And so, but beyond that, there are not a lot of, there probably are examples. I don't know that I could speak to one like neighborhood anywhere necessarily, but there are, as Erica and Jamel alluded to, there are people experimenting right now all over the country. One place that's really seems to be producing a lot of interesting experiments is Minneapolis, because they were so central to what was happening in the summer of 2020, where they have a lot of emerging ad hoc, small experimental programs of non-police response, of hotlines that are non-police response for conflict resolution, of all kinds of different things that people are doing to kind of try to implement the world that they're building towards just by doing it with their own hands. So that's one place to look.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Commissioner Dash. Go ahead, Dash, and then we'll get you next, Commissioner Burton.
I've just been talking a lot, so I wanted to, all right. Thank you again for the slideshow and the pamphlet. I think one question that I have is what resources do you wish you had where you could take this study to another level? Like, would you want translation, whatever? Like, what would be very helpful to get even a better snapshot of the city so that it could paint a more even clearer picture in future years? And I think that's, both for the people's budget as well as the city. Like, what are things that you wish that you would see as more surveys come out?
That's a question. That's a really good question, and one I may sit with a bit beyond what our time here. But for one, I think what we really need is like hyper accessible information online, and easily distributed information, easily accessible, that really gets into the weeds, but in ways that people can understand. And also there is so much that is actually not, that is kind of, I think, kind of concealed in a way about how, as the council member was saying earlier, like talking about how the money gets spent. But even with the documents that we do have, so much is still concealed in terms of of where the money funnels to within each department, and including like the police department. When we've tried to figure out how they're spending all this money that they have, it's actually pretty hard to find out in detail how they're spending the money that they have. And so more public transparency around the data, around the budget, and around how money is used will be really valuable as one thing. But it's something that I'll sit with too. Thanks for the question.
Commissioner Burton.
Thanks a lot for being here. I have one question for clarification only, and then a more substantive question. When you're talking about health, and I heard Erica talking about it, and in the Black Assembly's budget, when you're talking about health, I'm making the assumption that you're also talking about mental health care as well?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
So my second question is not even related to that, but it's about public transportation.
Yes.
I have lived in New York and Washington and Chicago, so Nashville's driving me crazy.
Yeah.
Let me just say. But in the public transportation, I noticed in the transportation line, I noticed that your budget is significant, your proposal is significant. Can you name some of the things that you would add to that, particularly with regard to people who have less access? Because to me in Nashville, if you don't have a car, you can't get to work. I have two 21-year-olds now who are low income that I'm trying to help them find a job, but a lot of the jobs are not where they live.
Yeah, absolutely. The transportation system here is so far behind almost every other place. It's very frustrating. There are some organizations that work to put all their time and energy into thinking about these things. I know one that, I don't know what its status is now, how active it is, but it was called Music City Riders United, which was a kind of a union of bus riders that did some really important work around talking about expanding lines, expanding the frequency of the buses moving on those lines, going through later into the day, adding more kind of bus depot stations and stops, and shelters at those places so people could, be there without the weather being an impediment. And yeah, there's probably a lot more, but I think what I've heard from groups like Music City Writers United and some other groups is basically there has to be like investment that seems outrageous to the average person because we're so far behind that it needs to be a radical, massive investment in. And there have been small ones, but they're always kind of feel like crumbs that are given, to, okay, we'll put another shelter here and we'll add a couple more, we'll add a little bit more regularity to this line or to that line. But it needs to be more wholesale, I think, in terms of frequency and of places for people to get on and off, and at later hours for people who work late. So those are a few things. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Crinks, for coming and sharing. Okay. All right. Our next guests will be virtual. The City of San Antonio, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Department. We welcome them to our hearing, and we're now in your hands.
Thank you all for having us. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. One question for you. Can you hear me okay? And then can you see my screen okay?
Yes to both of those.
All right. So we can rock and roll then. Just by way of introduction, my name is Jonathan Butler. I'm an equity manager for the City of San Antonio in our Office of Equity. Nick Dominguez is with me tonight. Nick is our interim director of the Department of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And so along with Nick, I want to thank Melody for the invitation to be here with you all today. I'm going to take a small moment of personal privilege. I'm going to let you look at my road to the room. I like to do this whenever I give presentations so that people have some sense of who I am and an understanding of where I come from. My point of personal privilege is this: I am donning my tiger blue today, representing for my father, who is a proud alumnus of Tennessee State University, also just so happens to be the designer of the recently dedicated plots on you all's campus for the Rosa chapter of the Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. So I have to send that shout out on behalf of my father and my fraternity brothers. That gives you some sense of not only my connections to Nashville, but my sense of being a son of the South, a native of Atlanta, Georgia. I'm someone with 20 plus years of experience doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work in some shape or form. A former resident of Chattanooga, Tennessee, where I worked in city government there for 5 years. I managed our neighborhood housing and services development division. And so I am connected intimately with a lot of the things you have already brought forth as questions as you wrestle with challenges associated with needs and budget. What I want to say a little bit is just to frame some of my remarks today by giving you a quick snapshot of San Antonio. And then I am going to edit some of my presentation as I go along. I may go quickly through some of the slides so that I can leave plenty of room for you all to ask the questions. San Antonio, we are a population of about 1.5 to 1.6 million people now with updated census data. We're the second largest city in Texas and the seventh largest in the country. We have about 13,000 city employees, 40 city departments, a $3 billion budget. We are a strong city manager-led government with regards to our programs, service delivery, and executions associated with the delivery of services for the employees of the city of San Antonio. We have a mayor and we have 10 city council members who affirm the budgets that we are talking intimately about today. We are also a city that has challenges with poverty and income and racial segregation. The members of the southern part of our city live on average 20 years less than members in our more affluent northern communities, and the lines tend to break heavily based on race and income. When we talk about racial equity, therefore, we think it's important to say why racial equity is important in the budgeting process and why thinking about low-income residents is also important in the budgeting process. We know that racial inequities continue to be deep and pervasive and persistent across all indicators of success, including education, jobs, housing, income, and health. We know that government has played a role in creating and maintaining many of those disparities and inequities. And our idea is that we use government to intervene to dismantle and disrupt some of the inequities that continue to be persistent in our city. We are a citywide office. We focus on advancing social justice and equity within government. We touch all 40 city departments. We are a small but mighty team of 4. And each one of us has the duties and responsibilities of liaising with about 10 to 12 entities that make up those 40 departments. We think about this whole concept of equity through this idea of awareness. That's really our capacity building component to our work. That's our training apparatus. That's our normalizing apparatus. And then we think about organizing people, behavioral and institutional change. We think about individual change also that's necessary to advance better outcomes. And then we put a bucket of policy change, some of the things that I'm going to talk to you about today with regards to budgeting for equity. The next slide really exemplifies a lot of those strategies if we were to break them down into the framework of the Government Alliance of Race and Equity. We were talking about it in this way, talking about normalizing, organizing, and operationalizing. What I am going to center on today is thinking about how do you operationalize equity through the execution of specific tools. And the tool today on display is really budgeting for equity. We have a number of tools from racial equity atlas that is an interactive map, all the way down to the ways we have associated rapid responses to resources based on the COVID pandemic and based on ARPA allocations of resources. And so we think about tools in terms of the operational bucket. The other buckets, we think about organizing people, and then we think about behavior change. How do we ensure that we normalize concepts for people throughout the spectrum of city employment? I'm going to contrast these two definitions of equity for the purposes of this conversation. When we think about equity, we think about fair and just opportunities and outcomes for all. That's the concept of equity generally. When we talk about racial equity, we think about the elimination of systemic and institutional racism so that all racial and ethnic groups can prosper and reach their full potential. What we aim to do then with our budget equity tool is to center racial equities and how disparate outcomes have adversely impacted communities of color and low-income communities. What is the tool itself? And we are now on the 4th iteration of this tool. We have tweaked it every year based on feedback and based on things that we have hoped to gain efficiencies around. But the tool itself is a set of questions intended to guide city departments in assessing how their budgets could potentially benefit and burden communities. Again, centering communities of color and low-income communities in the decision-making process. I will also say this about the tool. Each department is responsible for answering and responding and completing the tool. I'll get into later some of the semantics of how that works, but I do want you to know it's the responsibility of each department to account for some equity-oriented thinking and outcomes in everything that they do in their budgets. That's the goal. I want to use this slide not to talk fully about the contrast of equity versus equality, but I want to say it in a budgeting context. Oftentimes within city budgets, we look at council districts and we look at how we distribute resources equally. Council District 1 oftentimes gets the same allocations of resources as Council District 10 for the same problems across the board. That's an equality-based approach. If you think about equity, you think about where the need is within those individual council districts, and you appropriate resources and allocate them according to need. So in Council District 1, you may have a high need for transportation. In Council District 10, you might have a higher need for social services. Instead of splitting the pot equally, the idea is to make the investments where the need is identified. Being very data-driven is a way to account for need. And it's also a way in which we have emphasized racial equity because racial disparities continue to guide outcomes here in San Antonio. What's the thing itself? When we think about budgeting for equity, we're talking about integrating explicit considerations for racial and economic equity within departments. We've created a universal tool to provide a structured way to apply equity concepts and equity thinking. We call it using an equity lens to decision making. And we like to talk about this as both a product and a process. Yes, you are doing something in which you create actual numbers that attach to actual outcomes, but it's equally important to think about people and center people in the process. And that includes the people who are working within the departments who make decisions based on programs, services, and the execution of that service delivery. And so the hope that these serve as a guide to make sure that folks understand that the end of the line service worker is just as important in the process of decision making to determine where resources should go as the executives who are making uniform decisions. When we think about the goals, we talk about analyzing the department's overall equity approaches with one question, thinking about their overall budget. The second thing, we identify programs that help advance equitable outcomes. We want them to highlight specifically the programs and the investments associated with those programs that speak to equity-oriented thinking and equity-oriented outcomes. We then assess the equity impacts of the budget for potential benefits on communities of color and low-income communities. And then we try to ensure that the programs, projects, and investments actually are targeted to reduce disparities. We do it with a set of 4 questions. One, talking about the overall budget, as I mentioned. The other questions are program level, and they analyze whether or not those programs are applying an equity lens and what the metrics are for performance to ensure that we're accountable for those equity outcomes and results. The last thing I'll say with this is a snapshot of how we have changed the tool to inform decision making. Previously, we had a tool that had 10 questions Many of the questions were centered on overall budget, and they accounted for various aspects of how the department might be exercising equity within it, including an analysis of some of their diversity and inclusion initiatives. In this current reiteration, we take 4 questions instead. If your answer to one of them is no, you don't move forward to the other 3. And so the idea is that we are only accounting specifically for departments who are recognizing where their equity wins can possibly be, and then there are dollar values tangibly attached to it. Closing the gaps so that race and income and gender and ability and status and other forms of identity don't predict one's outcomes and successes. We think that that's important. And so we've designed a tool that helps reduce disparities by targeting strategies and investments to improve the health and well-being for those who are worse off. I went through that really quickly so that I could give you some time to ask some questions that may center on the technical aspects of what we're doing here. And thanks to the council person for our earlier shout out, we are looking at this and continuing to evolve our tool towards the needs that best fit our community as well. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Butler. I'm going to begin with the first question, then we're going to go to Dr. Richmond. Since you've been using this equity tool, has there been a percentage increase in the area of people of color and low-income people?
Has there been a percentage increase in our community?
No. In the allocation of the budget. Whatever the percentage was before you started using the equity tool, whatever that was, has that percentage of the budget of San Antonio increased in its allocation toward people of color and poor folks?
I would say yes. I think the significant difference, for example, comes in how we are able to account. So let's take an emergency housing assistance program. The analysis that is applied to the distribution of those resources now, previously it was a one-size-fit-all. It was a first-come, first-served application process. What happens now is through our tools of both recognizing where people are and where they live and what races and what incomes they are geographically made up of, we can track then the folks who are applying for the programs, where they live, and can make tangible decisions about resource allocations in specific parts of community that have traditionally been disinvested and marginalized. So those folks get prioritized then and moved up in the scoring matrix that is associated with the allocation of those resources. Those are some tangible impacts in which we know that people who are the most in need then are the ones who are getting resources first. So that's just one example in how we can track success and make a determination that, yes, we have seen changes in the allocations of resources, in part because we're changing the decision-making processes that go into how we make decisions about how we disperse resources. Does that make sense? Is that clear?
Yes. Dr. Richmond, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Butler, for being here. I was noticing it when you were talking about your assessment. You've heard, I assume you were listening to the first part of the hearing. We've heard a lot from here in Nashville about community participation. In your assessment in creating this equity lens, community participation is there in your budgeting process?
That's an excellent question. So this year, the city manager did something different than he's done before. He went out based on communications and the advancement of the work that we've attempted to do, and actually had sessions within community. I think they had maybe 6 different sessions within community where they actively talked about what the budget proposals are and got feedback and participation in that way. That's one thing that's a market change. The second thing that is a market change is the actual accounting for equity within the presentations. So all of those departments that are submitting their budgets then have sections in which they are accounting for what they plan to do within the equity space according to their budgets. This is both city manager driven and requested by city council members to ensure that they too are listening to, responsive to, and then adjusting policies based on some forms of participation. I did zero-based and budgeting for outcomes when we were with the city of Chattanooga. This is not that, right? And I think many of the representatives who spoke earlier said, well, oftentimes in zero-based budgeting or what we call budgeting for outcomes, there are processes that are carved out where certain percentages of the money have some participatory and community input. Because we are city manager driven and we also are a balanced budget city, there are considerations in which we have some public participation, but it's also largely a budget that is created then trying to take those things in mind as the city manager makes the presentation to the council members. So public engagement and the way we do it, we've had some of the same things that we have heard and recognized within movements that are accounting for ways to reimagine public safety. Some of the responses to that is we have reapportioned and reallocated some resources towards ensuring that there are more social services components embedded in public safety. Yes, you still have traditional funding mechanisms for law enforcement personnel. And of course, there are pensions that are also associated with things that are in our budgets. But yeah, there are some processes that have been participatory. And the other ways in which we have participatory activity from community is those departments individually are also accounting for what they are hearing and receiving for community and trying to translate into what they are fashioning as remedies as far as the budget presentation and allocation.
Thank you, Jonathan and Nick, for being here. I have two kind of logistical questions, or I can kind of combine it into one, but just as you can tell from the previous panelists and stuff, the theme that we're sort of hitting on is accessibility when it comes to the participatory pieces of these budgets. And so I think the question that I have, in a previous hearing about housing, for example, an example that sort of came up was technology. And so we talked about there was a city website that was super outdated and didn't pull up on folks' phones and things like that. And so wondering what steps the city of San Antonio has done to have accessibility through technology. And then the second question I have is, obviously, being in Texas, I'm sure you have a large Latinx population, immigrant population. For the participatory pieces, what did you all do for language accessibility on that front? And while we're on the topic, if there was anything for any for anyone that may not be able to access technology on that front, what you did for accessibility there. So just a few bullet points as I kept going. So thank you.
Thank you for that. I'll say this. One of the things that we've attempted to do is the needs-based calculations of community, and what we continue to hear from community is many of our solutions are often only accessible through digital mechanisms, which is not accounting for the true needs of folks in our community. We have a significant digital divide in our community, and there are tons of reasons that we have to make things more accessible through things that are outside of the digital domain. I think we are looking at trying to ensure that we have just as much effective ground presence. We have, we were piloting a city hall on the go mobile almost repurposed food truck, if you will, where we were going to people in community delivering services. Of course, COVID has put a snag on some of these plans, but we're thinking about not just the digital access, but also the ways in which people are consuming information that might not be digital in nature. To get to the second component of what you're thinking about, and pairing that with a little bit of your first question, yes, we have language accessibility that is now a driving initiative within the department. Based on what we are hearing from community, we are creating positions within this new organized department that specifically speak to some of the challenges associated with language access, translation needs, and languages other than English and Spanish. The second thing we are attempting to do is make sure that our website and all of our digital platforms are accessible in both Spanish and in English. And then we're working on other languages to ensure that we've got appropriate connectivity to translate other materials too. We have that same challenge with ensuring that our programs and the applications for participation also meet those same language thresholds. So these are all things that we continue to update and are ongoing. The last thing I'll say in terms of language accessibility, as a city government, we also have to be conscious of the fact that people consume information at varying education levels. And one of the things that we're trying to take stock of is ensuring that how we are communicating with people meets them where they are in languages that they understand, in simplified ways that are easier to understand. So as we think and work through even some of our dashboards that connect directly to community, in some instances, we are moving towards infographics. We're moving towards less words in communication to try to ensure that we are conveying messages that are easier for people to understand. All of this stuff fits into the accessibility and equity domain. And so we are trying to be accountable in those ways for all ways in which people communicate in our community.
I have one more question from Dr. Tran, who's been holding on. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Can you see me, Jonathan, or can you hear me? Thank you for speaking to us today. I really appreciated two aspects of your presentation, which is a more defined or more specific definition of equity and inequity, being racial inequity that's tied in with class. But also this, we've talked about overall budgets, but you've also talked about budgets within departments. My question to you is, how are those departments, we've talked about political leverage here about budgets and advocating for particular budgets. How do you hold these departments accountable, or how do you get them to comply to these notions or measures of inequity or inequity that you're going after? Is it something that's built into the city system, or how is that structured?
Excellent question. You want to go, Nick? You want to say something first?
I was just going to chime in on the last question, but I think as far as budgets go, I think it's a leadership structure from a need to listen to I think it comes from the city manager on out, the importance of equity and the importance of this. And so I don't think we've ever had sort of an issue on sort of quote unquote holding department directors on it, their feet to the fire on the implementation of it. I think there's a natural expectation from city leadership. The city of San Antonio has 40 departments. Each department answers to an assistant city manager who's in charge of a portfolio of 6 to 10 departments, and then the city manager. So that's how the organizational structure works. I don't really think there'd be any sort of bucking on that. I think it's an expectation that be worked through. I was going to chime in on the language access plan. Another component, not within our DEI department, but orbiting very close to us, is an immigration liaison. Facilitate sort of conversations with the immigrant communities, and correct that there's a lot of Latinx, but there's also plenty of non-Latinx, and helping to ensure that they those communities are able to navigate the city services that are available. So I hope I answer the question.
I'll just say one more thing to build on what Nick said. There isn't, never underestimate the power of real leadership at the top of the spectrum. And so the city manager's insistence and the city council and mayor's insistence that equity be centerpiece and prioritized is significant. Yes, having worked with my share of department directors, there are some who, may be slower to the dance than others. And there are some who don't quite understand completely the critical thinking that is the exercise of developing an equity lens. But how we have built in a working relationship is trying to ensure then that we as equity officers have those relationships and provide the technical assistance that each of those departments needs to be able to both understand what we're talking about, to account for the ways they're doing it in their work, and then 3, tell people about it, to where you say, hey, for example, each department has at least 1 or 2 people on the citywide equity committee that we look at as our policy think tank for the whole organization. That's then an investment of time and resources that they are accounting for. And so that for each department then is some type of win. We have an equity training program in which most of the departments have sent representatives to participate and be trained in that program that then go out and train in their departments. So those are ways in which folks are making the investment in equity. Once they start clearly understanding how they are allocating resources towards equitable outcomes, then they have a better connection with how their work can actually be moved in ways that account for more equity-oriented, outcome.
Thank you all so much for your time and your expertise. We've been working on this equity lens thing for quite a number of years, and we really appreciate you sharing with us. Thank you so much. Our last presenter for tonight, it would be the Office of the Mayor. Good evening. We are in your hands.
Good evening, and I just want to first of all say thank you. Thank you for inviting us to this very important conversation. Perhaps even before we get into the testimony we were asked to provide here, I just want to say thank you to your executive director. I realize that this is one of her last and final days here. It has been a pleasure to work with you in the last couple of years through some very challenging time periods. So Director Mel Fowler-Green, we just wish you the best of luck in wherever you move on to, and whatever we can do to support you and make you successful, please reach out and count on us to do that. Thank you. My name's Kristen Wilson. I'm the Chief of Operations and Performance for Mayor John Cooper. Diego, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Diego Guillarte. I am Director of Performance Management.
Correct.
Mayor's office as well. I'm Diego Guillarte from Mayor's office, Director of Performance Management. Oh.
For both of us, yes. The masks make it extra challenging, doesn't it?
Double mask, sorry.
Well, again, thank you for inviting us for this very important conversation. I've been invited to make a brief opening statement regarding how we've been implementing equity in Metro's budget process. I'm grateful to have a chance to discuss this with you today. I believe we benefit from learning from each other and always are looking for ways to improve, whether in applying best practices from other cities like San Antonio, which you'll find we've referenced in the past recently, or hearing ideas homegrown here in Nashville. Before we speak to the equity topic more directly, I think it's really important to note that Metro has 2 budgets that are adopted each year, and I don't know if that came up earlier or not. First, there's the capital improvements budget, which is then turned into an authorized capital spending plan. and second, there's the operating budget. These budgets are adopted on similar timeframes by June 30th, but the capital spending plan can be authorized, and indeed, in some years, there's more than one, throughout the year, subject to council rules. Secondly, the stakeholders in the budget development process are worth mentioning. First and foremost, of course, are the residents and visitors of Metro. We're always listening for their input and collect it from a wide variety of sources, whether it's public meetings we're attending, public hearings, input from a wide variety of advisors that we have in the mayor's office, concerns and needs presented to accessible resources like the hub, and our conversations and check-in with department heads, department members, employees, members of the union, and constituents we serve. Our budgets are ultimately designed to be responsive to the needs presented by the public. Second, and also importantly, are council members. They're another resource for collecting public input. 35 districts allow for significant representation. They also hold specific public hearings and education sessions on the budget, which I think Councilmember Suarez spoke to earlier. They also amend the proposed budget based on this input and further hearings that they hold in their authorization process. Third are the department heads and elected officials. I note that many of our department heads are led by commissions and boards, such as yourself. These are citizen-led bodies that hold public hearings, hold public information meetings, hold public meetings and collect input. We also seek to make those representative. A point of particular pride in this administration, those appointments are over rolling time periods, but we have particular point of pride is the degree to which we have been increasing diversity and representation on those boards and commissions. That has been very important to make sure that we are informing as broad a process as possible. They submit the changes they're recommending for their budget, as well as justifications for these changes. They work each with the administration and with council, each and separately throughout the process. Administratively, the mayor proposes a budget reflecting the priorities upon which she or he was elected and assess needs from those above inputs, which is prepared with department heads, elected officials, finance, and law. Finance also has some very specific roles authorized in this process, some from the charter itself, such as setting our revenue forecast. This can't be changed or amended by council without changes to the tax rate, for example. Finally, our budgets do require final approval from the state of Tennessee and have to fit within a financial framework prescribed by the state comptroller and a legal framework prescribed by the state legislature. Importantly to our discussion, in the FY21 budget, Metro Council authorized, with Mayor Cooper's full support, 2 equity roles in the Metro government. The first is the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer in our Finance Department. This is intentionally located in our Finance Department for the purposes of increasing equity in our administrative processes, including the budget and procurement, and to align it with and dedicate an office to the city's responsibilities of long-term DEI success, stability, accountability, and sustainability. This has now already been grown to 3 people. The second is a workforce diversity manager in HR who's working with departments to support department-level human resource DEI needs, in particular helping us increase our diversity in our staffing. These 2 roles were filled over the course of the last fiscal year, and they're critical to our goals of increasing diversity, access, and inclusive participation to the work of serving the people of Nashville and Davidson County. Indeed, I had suggested that the Chief of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Andrea Blackman, join us today. I know Executive Director Mel Fowler-Green, she mentioned she had talked with you, and you're very familiar with her role and scope. I believe you've discussed this hearing. I'm going to defer to you on any follow-ups with her as well, although we'll be happy to support those. Ms. Blackman is traveling, and though I understand her to be listening, I think I've actually got an email from her. I mentioned it appears that she's used San Antonio as a benchmark for some equity tools we're going to talk about. I would recommend strongly as a follow-up to today's discussion that she be included in any discussion of equity at Metro in the future. Further, I feel relatively certain that many of your needs and questions today may need to be referred to Ms. Blackman for response. The Director of Office Performance Management, Diego Igarte, is here with me today to both engage in answering questions about our budget process, tools, and metrics, and also to help us compile any questions that might need to be referred to her. So you've asked us, what equity goals and processes have we implemented or intend to implement with regard to the Metro budget? How do you measure success in these efforts, and what measures can be taken to institutionalize equity as a goal moving forward? For the capital spending plan that we brought forward in the fall, As we refined and reviewed the capital improvements budget into a capital spending plan, our Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, Ms. Blackman, participated in this process with us. She joined us for all department-level discussions in the capital spending plan. Each proposed investment required an equity statement of how the investment furthered equity. Diego's team partnered with Ms. Blackman to create an internal beta equity map, overlaying census data, race, ethnicity, and income, in which each capital spending plan line item to understand which communities were impacted and to understand our level of investment. This beta map is still under development by the Equity and Inclusion Office, which they expect to publish when their website's launched this year. Statistical references were made to gauge whether each capital spending plan item served communities who were well represented or underrepresented relative to metro population demographics. For example, if a project fell in a community where race, ethnicity, percentage breakdown reflected that in metro, we made that indication. Likewise, the same indication was made for projects in community that fell above or below the average household income relative to the federal poverty line. This tool was then used to evaluate projects and refine the capital spending plan to make the recommendation for council. Now, we've had a couple lessons learned, and we'll be very transparent about that. This was our first attempt to use this tool in this process. We had asked departments to articulate how their project submission impacted equity. We found that education is needed to quantify and help departments better articulate this answer. While we had some very strong and very good cases presented to us, we also found that we had some that we really felt needed extra work from Ms. Blackman and from her team in helping that articulation. Another lesson learned, we have further work and opportunity to refine this tool, to take it into account. For example, any historical disinvestment that might not be reflected in the census data. I think somebody already had made the point that you need to take a look over a longer time period. We absolutely recommend that and are looking into how to build that historical data into our tool. That said, we're excited to be creating the tools and closely working with our Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office in refining proposals and decisions. In front of us in the next months ahead is the FY23 operating budget. Once again, we're partnering closely with our Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer in preparing for this budget. The budget submission already relayed to departments, so again, hopefully that's already been shared with you all, includes a required equity statement filled for any modifications submitted by a department or office. The Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer compared 3 budget equity tools in terms of the content and usability and designed one to be used this year as a starting point for our department heads. She will also be offering a Budget Equity 101 virtual training for all of our department heads. The session's designed to normalize and operationalize budget equity concepts and practices within our departments. The 2-phased equity session includes an introduction to advanced equity and budget preparation, followed by an introduction to guided practices and how to assess how their overall budget allocations benefit and/or burden communities. The operating budget does not lend itself as well to map-based visualization as our capital budget. Funding is often diffuse geographically, such as topics like the employee pay plan, the mayor's recent proposal to make Juneteenth a paid metro holiday, investments in health equity, community safety, etc. Our intent, instead of visualizing on a map, is to use the budget tool and the investment justifications to help us define the return we're getting on those investments, much as we do with our other metrics, and then to hold the departments accountable to that. Our goal this year is to be able to make decisions from and ultimately propose our investments in terms of the equity goals they further, as well as the progress they make on the key priorities we've already presented in our budget memo. 1, sustain an equitable emergency response to the pandemic. Continue supporting public health approaches to disease management, health equity, and access and behavioral health impacts of the pandemic. Further consider health and all policies, impacts of the pandemic response to systemic solution needs, such as in education, crime and justice, economic opportunity, housing, and transportation. 2, invest in key economic priorities. I won't go through quite as many words because I know we're getting late this evening and I'm running long, but education, again, one of our primary, and we're very proud of the investments that we made in last year's budget around teacher pay, public safety and justice, and economic opportunity. And 3, sustain and further neighborhood infrastructure across transportation, sustainability, affordable housing, and our neighborhoods. As we have told departments, 2 key principles guide investment in the above priorities, and departments are asked to consider all their investments and potential changes and resources through 2 lenses. 1, performance, articulating budget adjustments and new investments in terms of the impact and benefit to the community, focused on delivering services more effectively or efficiently. And 2, equity. As our community's needs have evolved throughout the pandemic, we are going to seek to build back stronger in key areas that increase our capacity to meet future challenges. We are seeking to link equity directly and inextricably with each department's overall budgeting process. Thank you again for the opportunity to meet with you today. I will reiterate that I hope you all have the opportunity to meet our Chief of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, Andrea Blackman, and her team, and also our Workforce Diversity Manager, Rogel Jones. They are both making an important difference in our government, and they have our full confidence and support in achieving the goals of furthering representation, access, fairness, and inclusiveness, progress in our organizational processes, decision-making, policy development, staff engagement, and our community relations. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Commissioner Burton.
Thank you both for being here tonight.
Of course.
I would like to know if the mayor's office actually interacts with either the People's Budget or the Black Assembly or the other groups when it comes time to set the budget. Do they actually hear from them? And I'm asking the question because there's a difference between having a diversity and equity department that does some things and tries to raise awareness about, you know, I don't know, I'm tired because I'm tired tonight, but I've been doing this work for 40 years. I'm just tired. There's a difference between doing diversity, equity, inclusion work to raise awareness among staff and the people that you work with and actually implementing the things that would make for that kind of budget. So I want to know if the People's Budget or the Black Assembly's budget is even considered seriously by the mayor's office when budget starts to be put together.
Now, I appreciate that question. The surveys that have been done and the results that have been published in the last couple of years have been done after, by those organizations have been done after our proposed budget has been done. So we are always looking a year back on the last results. They have timed them between when our proposed budget comes out and when the council decision is made. And so as a result, and I think in many cases, because they wait to react to the proposed budget, which is perfectly fine in their process. But that is the reality of the timing for that. Now,
have there been discussions about using the information that is now being gathered for upcoming processes?
Absolutely. And one of the things we were even talking through before this meeting was some of the amounts of investment requests that were made, even in last year's. We actually met and exceeded in a many number of cases, ultimately in the budget that passed. So we're going to go back through and map that and take a look at where we did meet it and where we didn't. But there were a number of ones already where I feel like there was a lot of consistency in the investment priorities that were made in this last budget, and what ultimately had been proposed, again, came after our proposed budget in that data set.
Commissioner Diaz.
Thank you very much for being here. I wanted to ask very quickly whether I think it's great that you're doing all this statistical work about the impact in the budget, but I was wondering if the mayor's office actually spent time talking directly to oppressed communities. And the reason why I ask is because I think that if you look at the impact of the budget, but you analyze it just from the perspective of the government without asking the people who are being directly affected, that is a problem.
I don't disagree with you. I think the participation and gathering of input and information is really important. I think that no one's ever done, right? And I don't think anyone, if I were to say to you, I think we do that perfectly, you guys should just walk me out of this room. We always have opportunity to get better at that. What I will say is we have a lot of coverage. For example, we have an individual who's a policy advisor in the mayor's office who directly interacts with new Americans. And we spend time soliciting his opinion, soliciting his feedback, understanding his interactions, not just in this isolated period, but over the course of the year. What has he learned? What has he seen? What does he think we need to fund? One, for example, he has already raised the concept of taking a look further. I don't know if you've formally published your final language access document, but when we were in the draft process still, he brought that forward and said, I have some selective investments that I see as being meaningful and interesting from my conversations with some of the nonprofits and NGOs that are in this space and looking and reviewing this work. So that would be only one example of it, and that's one population. And as I said, I'm not gonna ever claim we have 100% coverage. You'd have to get down to an individual one-on-one conversation. But I do feel like we have the opportunity to sit down and look for areas of input and feedback. And again, we charge our policy folks, we charge our hub data, we charge our departments as we're doing this, because we check in throughout the year too on budget and sort of overall, what are you seeing, what's going on out there as we go too. So again, not perfect, but I do feel like we have efforts underway, and I want us to get better at that.
I think that's great. I've worked in the past with the Office of New Americans. I think they do a good job, but also I would like to emphasize that I think it's really important that you talk directly to the communities, because the NGOs and then the communities and the people in government doing DEI work are different groups. But thank you so much for that.
Yeah,
appreciate it.
Commissioner Vinnick.
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much for being here. I have two questions.
Sure.
First, we know that Nashville has a mayoral-driven budgeting process, and you're describing certainly a lot more being done on equity that's been done in the past. My concern is that when Mayor Cooper's administration is over, whenever that may be, a new mayor's going to come in and all that stuff is gone. So my question to you is, are you aware of whether the mayor's office is willing to work with the council to institutionalize the process that you're describing?
No,
And that's the first question.
Okay.
The second question is, I think you described a document such as an equity map or something along the lines where basically the departments are going through and doing an equity analysis of various capital improvement and or actual operating budget expenditures. Are those documents open for public inspection?
I'm going to ask you to handle the second one if you don't mind, Diego, and even the first one, but let me just take the first one really quickly and just note that I strongly believe the rationale of council in placing the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office in finance was to create greater sustainability across political changes in locating it there. And the same is true for the workforce diversity manager being in HR. It's not in the mayor's office, it's over in those so that we can institutionalize those processes. And again, if you think about the tools we're talking about, we are talking about things like investing in adopting software tools as well as creating tools that are used. The intent there would be that then those reside, again, in those organizations versus in the mayor's office. Now, I've worked in another administration. I worked for Mayor Kasim Reed in Atlanta, and then I transitioned in Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms. I know that changes can happen, and I know changes can happen for very good reasons. There could be the next mayor who has an even stronger and better vision. There could be technology that evolves that become better tools. There could be best practices that are created, particularly, again, in communication and outreach. I think we're all hungry for that. And so I hope this evolves and changes, but I hope it evolves and changes in progressive and positive ways.
Great, thank you.
Diego, do you want to speak to the map?
Yes, and to documentation being open to the public in general. Can you hear me? Am I far away?
Oh, yeah.
There's an anecdotally for the first stab at doing the equity justification. There is a document. It is definitely it's painfully obvious that it was a very staged exercise when we tried to roll it out. It was alluded to earlier that some of the departments did an excellent job of describing the justifications. There's other ones that I'm going to use the expression from the folks in San Antonio that they're slower to the dance not only in their understanding of equity, but their readiness to participate fully in this type of efforts. One thing that it is worth noting that now what that process is evolving to in the very next budget exercise, because we are integrating that part with the actual system submission of the departments, the accessibility of those documents will be far more aligned with what it always has been any other budget submission, right? So when the department submits via system to the budget office what they are asking for, this is another variable, another line item, if you will, that would be included in those submissions, therefore available to the public. Now, to recognize previous presenters, although we have a lot of these data that is quote unquote accessible, part of my scope is that it's not only accessible, but actually usable or actionable, understandable for the public, right? So we can have data sets that are massive and they're out there in open data. Technically, we are checking the box on accessibility. Now, is that actually a tool for the public to understand and hold us accountable for what we're doing or not doing? My opinion, absolutely not, right? So that is also something that we're working on. How do we make it more accessible? And Ms. Blackman's office will be instrumental to get us there. So short answer is, of course, everything is available to the public either via a specific request for it. We and the Office of Performance Management try to put out as much information as we can proactively, organically, but always looking, not only willing, but looking for public's input to ask for data. And if I don't have it, I'll put it together, right? That is, it's your information. And our job is to make it digestible.
Great, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I appreciate you all coming, and I know that in the invitation that we sent, we also asked for the chief DEI person with finance, thinking that maybe closer to the budget, get some more definite answers. I just want to circle back to part of Erwin's question that I don't know. I think he was asking, you know, the commission here and others in Nashville have been talking about an equity lens for years and concretizing it. And so, because policy shifts, even when the mayor changes or whatever, those policies change. Those people change. So I think his question is a valid one about, is the mayor up for sponsoring legislation that would codify this? Because right now it's just a benevolent act that really has not much meat or teeth to me. And I don't know if you know, or is that worth us, or because his question was, is the mayor up for codifying that?
I appreciate you reframing that. We would be very happy to work with anyone to figure out a better way to formalize that in the future. And whether that's directly through codes or it's through, for example, council rules that are set, et cetera, I'd recommend we invite them to the table as well through their Budget and Finance Committee. I've been thinking about this for a minute as well. I would not only consider and again, I would like for us to have the opportunity to continue to mature some of these processes. I think we're learning a lot along the way. I think there will be things we do that even you all say didn't really help, right? Or possibly didn't really advance us further. These things did, these things didn't. Spend more time here, or we identify gaps, and we're going to learn and evolve together on that. But I would like to, I think we could make a commitment to you now that before the end of the mayor's term, we'd be very willing to reach out and work with council, to work with you all in the best way to make sure that this is further institutionalized. I think that that's really where that question is going. And I would request that we not only do it with equity, I would request we continue to do it with the performance piece, because I think if you don't marry the two together, it's going to be very hard to maintain the accountability pieces of it. So again,
I didn't catch the end part of your
statement. Maintain the accountability of it. And so, for example, we are looking at an investment might get proposed. I mean, we can take one from last year. Let's say, we did a pretty significant funding in the behavioral health space for our partners in care pilots, right? And that has a short-term ability for us to manage through contracts. And we contracted with the mental health co-op, and we've gone through a fairly, it's a point of pride right now in my mind how well that pilot has been going, and as we're looking to expand it further. We have tracking going on of the coverage, the number of calls, and the results that are produced. And what I would recommend is that not only do you codify the intent of an equity justification or an equity investment, but that you also codify the outcomes that you're seeking, and you hold the departments ultimately accountable to making sure that they are doing that. And the reason is because we have a number of situations. Sometimes financial issues come up over the course of the year. Other things happen. Again, Director Fowler-Green can probably tell you there is the ability to flex within the budget and to repurpose funds or to use them differently. And again, there's also times when those programs are also not as effective as we hoped. And if you aren't measuring it and you're not getting metrics for it, your ability to understand why and to help that program become more effective is a lot harder. So again, I would recommend not only looking at codifying some of the equity activities and tools that are in this as we evolve them and work on them, but I would make sure that you get the metrics and the accountability in that too.
Thanks again for being here. I just have a quick question. You mentioned that, that there were some lessons learned, and I would love to know, just on a broad spectrum, I know we could dive deep into the weeds on each example and things like that, but, is there like a theme of the lessons learned that came from each department that's resonating? Is it obviously, we talked about community involvement or things like that, and I think the crux of the matter I'm trying to get to is that I think that there are a lot of people, organizations and folks in Nashville that maybe the mayor's office doesn't have to reinvent the wheel, that there's knowledge to kind of pull off of. And so just wondering, what were those lessons learned, or is there was like a thematic kind of piece when you were coming through that?
Yeah, I'll hand it over. Diego and I probably have different or maybe similar observations. Sure. I think a lot of it's articulation. I think a lot of departments both weren't, and I want to be fair to them. We haven't, this is the first time they had the chance to do it, and we didn't give them the strength of definitions, principles, how to give kind of further articulation to it. And so I think in a lot of cases, they didn't really know how to respond to the question. That's the point, and just so you know that we learn quickly, at least when we have these lessons learned, that's the point of us doing the training that we're going to be undertaking. And again, that our chief of DEI will be undertaking with our department heads is to help them a little bit more and to be more fair to them. She's already done that work. She's already worked through definitions for these things. And this is not the only project. Again, I don't want to I'm so confident in her work and I'm very proud of it, but I don't want to represent it for her. She needs to come and do that. But she's also working with the departments and she has assessment tools. So she's having hard conversations with them, working with them and their staffs, not just around budgeting, but around a whole wide range of everything from process to systems to culture.
Yes, my response was going to be the first is the description and definition of equity that we can all agree to, or if we can all agree to one, then that is the first right, because also to the previous point, for us to formalize and codify this, there needs to be an understanding. So again, anecdotally, some of the departments were like, okay, great, and I understand, but this is my interpretation of your definition, right? So how do we can actually officialize that description of equity and what is the agreed upon understanding? That is the driver for everything else, right? Because for us to manage and track and again, to build accountability mechanisms, I cannot reverse engineer that without having a proper definition that is agreed upon, and then the actual bodies that legislate and control we need that to drive every effort, right? So that was probably the biggest lesson learned to me, at least, was that we could have done a much better job the front end to help that define and not let it to be an organic interpretation of what is your understanding of equity. I'm sure if we asked all of you here, even though you probably have a lot of overlap, there will be some variance, right? So that definitely happened.
Well, we get to cheat off the city of San Antonio now, so that's good to hear. No, but I think that, you know, I appreciate that answer, because I don't think anyone up here, sorry, the mask is suffocating me sometimes. I don't think anyone up here is opposed to experimentation, right? I think that where the issue sometimes lies is, a phrase I like to use is like failing fast, right? The quicker we fail, the quicker we get to success. But sometimes it's finding that balance of just like, you know, sometimes we hold on to a project too long, and sometimes we let go too quickly. And so I just really want to emphasize of failing fast is I think critical. And I think that I really want to, I just wanted to make sure that I'm speaking on behalf of the council when I say that no one's opposed to the experimentation pieces, but we just want to make sure that it's failed fast and it has community input. So thank you so much.
And, you know, just thinking about this housing issue and using his failing fast, people have been screaming for a decade. But then we want to make a big deal, oh, we added an extra 40. That's not an extra 40 if I'm thinking about equity. Equity in the years that no attention was paid. Mm-hmm. Just because you say this on this year, to be equitable would at least be to acknowledge where you started being inequitable. So again, I just think that, because so much of the DEI thing for me has turned into a cottage industry, that it's not people who start out recognizing the racial and ethnic disparities that exist within this country, this city, that inform and maintain our policies and our laws. That to me is a whole different look than what, for me, a lot of DEI work does. It does not attack the systemic issue that allow us to say, hey, here's an extra 40 million when you have not been paying attention to that. And now people are paying that price. Even down into the contracting that goes into the budget, the Red River waste debacle, that years ago, it was for blacks and people of color and immigrants in this city. The water department and the trash pickup were the two major departments that hired a large number of blacks and immigrants. Well, they farmed that out, much to the chagrin of folk, and those very same workers suddenly went to work for the private contractors with less benefits and poor pay. So now you got a dog job that they can't live out their contract. So maybe the answer would be to take some of these funds, if you're going to be equitable, and turn that back into a metro job that would allow folk to stay here, have a decent benefit, because trash is not a problem until nobody picks it up. And so I think this idea of equity, because that's a budget issue, that is an expenditure of the General Service Department that I don't know if we look at it, but to check the DEI boxes for me, I'm so tired of those. I really am. I mean, I've done this stuff. I do conflict management. I hold strategic visioning sessions with companies and all that. And it's so missing the point of what it means to take a real look and, as my mother used to say, put on your big boy underwear and fix the problem. So again, I definitely appreciate you all taking your time coming and sharing. And we definitely want to continue this conversation, and I'm sure we will. We are going to miss Mel, and we thank her for her work. I met Mel in these streets, and we wish her so much success in her next endeavor, but also nobody knows what it takes to put these 4 back-to-back hearings together, and now comes the hard work of putting out a great report for the city. I also am grateful to the commissioners who time and time again not only give of themselves to the regular meeting, but all the other stuff that for folks who really want to get involved that you do. So, and for a lot of what we do, it goes unnoticed, but I definitely, as chair, appreciate it. Thank you all very much. And Mel, do you need to say something? You just wasn't going to talk tonight. Is that, what is that? Can we entertain a motion to adjourn? We are adjourned. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information on this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.